Most people think they know why the Roman Empire fell. Ask anyone on the street, or watch any Hollywood blockbuster, and you'll get a clean, cinematic answer. Picture it. The marble columns are crumbling, the senators are corrupt and decadent, the gladiators are fighting in the Colosseum, and then, suddenly, the horns blow. Massive, fur-clad barbarians with axes and broadswords breach the gates of Rome, burning the city to the ground, and the light of classical civilization is snuffed out by the forces of darkness. It's a dramatic story. It has clear villains, a clear climax, and a clear moral about the dangers of moral decay and military weakness. End of story. But here's the problem with that version of events. It's not entirely wrong, but it is dangerously, catastrophically incomplete. And when you strip away the simplified, romanticized narrative of Edward Gibbon and the Hollywood sword and sandal epics, and you actually follow the money, the tax codes, the supply chains, and the metallurgical composition of the coins in the pockets of ordinary Romans, you discover something far more unsettling. The Roman Empire didn't fall because it was murdered by barbarians. It fell because it committed economic suicide. It collapsed under the crushing weight of its own ledger. The barbarian invasions of the 5th century were not the cause of the fall. They were the symptom. They were the executioners who merely kicked in the doors of a house that had already been hollowed out by decades of hyperinflation, catastrophic wealth inequality, supply chain collapse, and a military-industrial complex that bankrupted the state. Now, I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. The barbarians were real, the sacks of Rome were real, the violence, the displacement, and the sheer terror of the migration period were profound human catastrophes that reshaped the demographic map of Europe forever. Nothing I say in this video should be interpreted as minimizing the reality of the violence that accompanied the end of the Western Roman Empire. But what economic historians increasingly argue, and what I think most people never learned, is that the fall of Rome wasn't primarily a military failure. It was a financial collapse. It was a crisis of currency, a crisis of taxation, and a crisis of complexity. The Germanic tribes didn't conquer a thriving, robust superpower. They migrated into, and eventually took over, a bankrupt, hyperinflated, heavily taxed shell of a state that could no longer afford to pay its own soldiers, maintain its own roads, or feed its own cities. To understand why the most powerful empire in human history disintegrated, you need to understand how deeply the Roman state was woven into a financial architecture that eventually consumed itself. So, let me take you back not to the sack of Rome in 410 AD, but to where this story really begins, centuries earlier, in a world where the seeds of economic collapse were planted not on the battlefield, but in the mints, the grain silos, and the imperial treasury. Part 1. The architecture of the Roman machine and the original sin. To understand the collapse, you first have to understand the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the machine that was the Roman Empire at its height. We often think of Rome as just a big country with a big army. But the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was the first truly globalized, integrated market economy in human history. It was a supply chain of unprecedented complexity. The Mediterranean Sea wasn't a border. It was a Roman lake, a massive, protected highway for commerce. You could load a ship with grain in Alexandria, Egypt, sail it to Ostia, and feed 1 million people in the city of Rome. You could mine tin in Britannia, smelt it with copper from Cyprus, and forge bronze tools in Gaul. You could press olives in Hispania, pack the oil into massive terracotta amphorae, and ship them to the legions stationed on the freezing frontiers of the Rhine and the Danube. Archaeologists map the economic health of the Roman Empire, not just by looking at temples, but by looking at shipwrecks and ice cores. During the Pax Romana, the number of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean skyrockets, indicating a massive boom in maritime trade. Ice cores from Greenland show a massive spike in lead and copper pollution, the direct result of industrial-scale smelting and minting that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. The Roman economy was a roaring, interconnected beast. It relied on a single universal currency, the denarius. The denarius was the silver coin that greased the wheels of this massive machine. A legionary in Syria could use it to buy wine from a merchant who brought it from Italy. A farmer in North Africa could use it to pay his taxes. The currency created trust. It created liquidity. It allowed for the division of labor on a continental scale. Because you had a stable currency, a potter in Gaul didn't need to barter his bowls for wheat. He could sell his bowls for denarii, knowing those coins would be accepted by a baker 300 miles away. But this incredible, complex system had a fatal structural flaw, an original sin embedded in its very foundation, and that sin was the Roman military-industrial complex. By the time of the Emperor Augustus, Rome had transitioned from a republic that expanded through seasonal warfare to an empire that required a massive, permanent, standing army to police its vast frontiers. Augustus established a professional army of roughly 300,000 men. These weren't citizen farmers who picked up a spear when the harvest was done and went home. These were career soldiers who served for 20 to 25 years. They required salaries, they required pensions, they required armor, weapons, food, and shelter. Let that sink in for a moment. In an agrarian, pre-industrial society, maintaining a standing army of 300,000 professional soldiers, plus the navy, plus the administration required to tax an empire of 60 million people, was an economic burden of almost unimaginable proportions. Modern historians estimate that the Roman military consumed anywhere from 50% to 75% of the entire state budget. Think about that. The vast majority of the wealth generated by the most powerful empire on earth was being funneled directly into the military just to maintain the status quo. During the Republic, the army paid for itself through conquest. You march into a new territory, you plunder the treasury, you enslave the population, you sell them, and you use the cash to pay the troops and fund the next campaign. It was a predatory, extractive economic model. But what happens when you run out of world to conquer? What happens when you reach the natural borders of the empire, the deserts of the east, the dense forests of Germania, the sands of the Sahara? The plunder stops. The influx of massive, sudden windfalls of gold and silver dries up. But the army doesn't go away. In fact, the army keeps getting more expensive. The legions on the frontier realized their own power. They realized that the emperor in Rome was entirely dependent on their loyalty. And so, a terrifying new political and economic mechanism was born, the donativum. The donativum was essentially a bribe. Every time a new emperor took the throne, or every time he needed to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard or the frontier legions, he had to hand out a massive cash bonus. If he didn't pay the donativum, the soldiers would simply assassinate him and replace him with a general who promised to pay them more. This created a structural deficit that could not be solved through normal taxation. The Roman tax system was relatively simple. They didn't have income taxes or complex corporate taxes. They relied on a poll tax, a tax on heads, a land tax, and customs duties. Raising taxes in the ancient world was incredibly difficult and politically dangerous. The empire was vast, communication was slow, and the administrative bureaucracy was relatively thin. If an emperor tried to raise taxes dramatically to pay for a new military bonus, the provinces would revolt. The local elites would hide their wealth. The peasants would flee. So, the emperors were trapped. They needed vast amounts of money to pay the military, to stay in power, and keep the barbarians out. But they couldn't raise taxes without triggering a civil war. They were facing a perpetual, grinding fiscal crisis. And this is where the story gets dark, and where the first domino of the Roman collapse is pushed. When a government is trapped between the impossibility of raising taxes and the absolute necessity of paying its military, it turns to the only tool left in the toolbox. It turns to the printing press. Or, in the case of the ancient world, the mint, the invisible tax, Nero and the birth of debasement. In 64 AD, the Emperor Nero faced a massive financial crisis. The Great Fire of Rome had destroyed huge swathes of the city, requiring an enormous rebuilding effort. At the same time, Nero was fighting a costly, protracted war against the Parthian Empire in the east over the control of Armenia. The treasury was empty. The legions needed to be paid. The contractors rebuilding Rome needed to be paid. Nero couldn't raise taxes without risking a revolt. So, he did something that would seal the fate of the Western Roman Empire 3.5 centuries later. He quietly recalled the silver denarii, melted them down, mixed in cheaper base metals like copper and bronze, and reissued them. Before Nero, the denarius was roughly 95% pure silver. It was a trusted, reliable store of value. After Nero's reform, the silver content was dropped to about 90%. The state took the same amount of silver and stamped it onto more coins. By doing this, Nero magically created money out of thin air. He could now pay his soldiers and his builders with the newly minted, slightly lighter coins. This is the ancient equivalent of quantitative easing. It is currency debasement. And it is the most insidious form of taxation ever devised by mankind because it is an invisible tax. When a government raises your income tax, you know about it. You get angry. You might vote the politicians out. You might riot. But when a government debases the currency, they are stealing your purchasing power slowly, invisibly, over time. The soldier who received his pay in Nero's new denarii didn't immediately realize he was poorer. He had the same number of coins in his purse. But when he went to the market to buy bread, wine, and leather, the merchants slowly began to realize that the new coins had less actual silver in them. To compensate for the loss of real value, the merchants raised their prices. This is inflation. Nero's debasement was relatively mild. It was a one-time trick to get through a specific crisis. But he had opened Pandora's box. He had established a precedent. He had shown future emperors that when the budget didn't balance, you didn't need to make the hard political choices of cutting military spending or raising taxes. You just went to the mint and clipped the coins. For the next century, as the empire faced border skirmishes, plagues, and civil wars, the emperors kept returning to this magic trick. Under Trajan, who was fighting massive wars in Dacia, modern Romania, the silver content dropped to 85%. Under Marcus Aurelius, as he fought desperate apocalyptic wars against the Marcomanni, on the Danube frontier, while the Antonine Plague decimated the tax base, the silver content dropped to 75%. The Roman state was funding its survival by slowly hollowing out its own currency. But as long as the empire was relatively stable, as long as the legions were winning, as long as the Mediterranean trade routes were open, the economy could absorb this mild inflation. The sheer volume of goods flowing across the empire masked the rot in the foundation. But then came the 3rd century, and the rot broke through the floorboards. The crisis of the 3rd century, hyperinflation, and the death of money. The year 235 AD marks the end of the stable Roman Empire, and the beginning of a nightmare known as the crisis of the 3rd century. It started when the emperor Alexander Severus was assassinated by his own troops, because he tried to negotiate a peace treaty with Germanic tribes instead of paying the soldiers to fight them. What followed was a period of absolute, unmitigated chaos that lasted for nearly 50 years. In a span of 5 decades, Rome saw over 26 different barracks emperors. Most of them were frontier generals who were declared emperor by their troops, marched on Rome, ruled for 2 or 3 years, and were then assassinated by their own troops when they couldn't pay them a large enough donativum. The political instability completely shattered the Roman economy. The frontiers collapsed. The Persians invaded from the east, capturing the Emperor Valerian and skinning him alive. Massive Germanic confederations breached the Rhine and the Danube, pillaging deep into Italy and Greece. The Mediterranean was overrun by pirates. The globalized supply chain that had defined the Pax Romana was violently severed. And how did these desperate, short-lived emperors to pay the massive armies required to fight off these simultaneous invasions and fight each other in civil wars? They debased the currency. But they didn't just clip it a little bit, they obliterated it. Under Emperor Gallienus, around 260 AD, the denarius, the backbone of the Roman economy for nearly 3 centuries, was completely destroyed. The silver content dropped from 95% under Augustus to less than 2%. The coins being handed to the legionaries weren't even silver anymore. They were bronze coins with a microscopic wash of silver on the outside that rubbed off after a few weeks of use. The result was hyperinflation on a scale that makes the Weimar Republic look manageable. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. We have papyri from Egypt during this period showing that the price of wheat, which had been relatively stable for centuries, increased by a factor of 1,000,000. Imagine the psychological terror of living in this environment. You are a merchant in Antioch. You sell a shipment of linen. You are paid in sacks of nearly worthless bronze coins. You know that by tomorrow, those coins will buy half as much grain as they do today. So, what do? You don't hold cash. You immediately run to the market and buy hard assets. You buy land, you buy gold, you buy grain, you buy anything that holds intrinsic value. This velocity of money, the speed at which people try to get rid of the currency, accelerates the inflation. The currency becomes a hot potato. Trust, the fundamental bedrock of any economy, evaporates. And when trust in the currency evaporates, something catastrophic happens to a complex society. It reverts to barter. If a Roman legionary on the Rhine frontier has a sack of worthless Gallienus bronze coins, The local farmer doesn't want them. The farmer knows the coins are garbage. So the farmer refuses to sell the legionary food. The supply chain breaks down. The army can't buy food locally. The state has to physically requisition grain and supplies at sword point, a system known as the annona militaris. The beautiful, elegant, interconnected market economy of the Pax Romana was dead. It had been replaced by a brutal command and command extraction economy. The state wasn't buying things anymore. It was just taking them. And this is where the human cost of the inflation becomes truly horrific. When the currency collapsed, the Roman state still needed to collect taxes to fund the war machine, but they couldn't accept their own worthless coins for tax payments. So, the state demanded that taxes be paid in kind. They demanded physical grain, physical oil, physical weapons, and physical clothing. The burden of this fell on the local elites, the town councilors known as the curiales. In the old days, being a curial was a prestigious honor. You collected the local taxes, handed them to Rome, and you got to build a nice bathhouse with your name on it. But in the 3rd century, being a curial was a death sentence. Rome would demand a specific quota of grain from your town. If the harvest was bad, or if the local economy had collapsed, you, the curial, had to make up the difference out of your own personal wealth. The middle class of the Roman Empire was systematically liquidated by the state's tax demands. To escape this ruinous financial liability, the wealthy elites fled the cities. They abandoned their townhouses, moved to their massive fortified rural estates, the latifundia, and essentially declared independence from the Roman tax system. They raised their own private militias to protect their lands from tax collectors and barbarians alike. Meanwhile, the poor, the smallholder farmers were being crushed by inflation and taxation. They couldn't survive on their own. So, they did the only thing they could do to avoid starving. They sold their land to the massive, fortified rural estates of the wealthy elites, and in exchange they agreed to work the land as tenant farmers. These tenant farmers were called coloni. They were legally bound to the land. They could not leave. Their children could not leave. Sound familiar? This is the exact origin of medieval serfdom. The free mobile citizenry of the Roman Empire was being transformed into a rigid agrarian caste system, not by barbarian conquest, but by the crushing weight of inflation and taxation. The cities, which were the engines of Roman civilization, began to empty out. People were fleeing back to the countryside just to survive. The urbanization that defined Rome was reversing. Diocletian's hubris, the edict on maximum prices. By 284 AD, the empire was on the verge of total disintegration. The treasury was empty, the frontiers were breached, the currency was worthless, and the population was starving. Enter the Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian was a brilliant military organizer and a ruthless autocrat. He looked at the chaos of the 3rd century and decided that the Roman Empire was simply too massive for one man to rule. He divided the empire into 4 parts, the tetrarchy, to better manage the borders. He reorganized the provinces, he doubled the size of the bureaucracy, and he fundamentally restructured the military. But Diocletian's greatest and most disastrous legacy was his attempt to fix the economy through sheer brute force central planning. Diocletian didn't understand the mechanics of inflation. He didn't understand that the inflation was caused by his own government, printing too much money to pay for his massive new army and bureaucracy. Like all autocrats facing a cost of living crisis, he looked for a scapegoat. He blamed the greed of the merchants. He blamed the speculators. He believed that prices were high because evil men were hoarding goods and artificially inflating the prices to cheat the common people and the soldiers. So, in 301 AD, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. This document is one of the most fascinating and tragic artifacts of economic history. It was inscribed on massive stone pillars and erected in market squares across the empire. It listed over 1,000 different goods and services, from a bushel of wheat to a pair of sandals to the hourly wage of a sewer cleaner, and it set a strict, legal maximum price for every single one of them. The preamble to the edict is a masterpiece of imperial outrage. Diocletian writes about the raging greed of the merchants, claiming that they are bleeding the soldiers and the poor dry. He declares that anyone caught selling a good for more than the maximum price will be put to death. He also decreed that anyone who hoards goods or refuses to sell them at the mandated price will also be executed. Furthermore, he froze the workforce. He decreed that every man must follow the profession of his father. If your father was a baker, you are a baker. If your father was a soldier, you are a soldier. You cannot change jobs. You cannot move to another city. Think about the staggering hubris of this moment. The Roman state, having destroyed the currency through decades of debasement, now attempted to override the fundamental laws of supply and demand by threatening the entire population with execution. What happened next is exactly what happens every single time in human history. A government attempts to enforce strict price controls in the face of a debased currency. It failed catastrophically. The merchants looked at the maximum prices set by Diocletian. They knew that the cost of producing the goods, the raw materials, the transport, the bribes to officials, was higher than the legal maximum price. If they sold their goods at Diocletian's prices, they would go bankrupt. So, they did the only rational thing. They stopped selling. The markets emptied out. The shops closed their doors. The farmers refused to bring their grain to the cities because they couldn't sell it for a profit. The black market exploded. If you wanted bread, you didn't go to the legal baker. You went to an alleyway and paid in gold, or you bartered a pair of boots for a sack of flour. The Roman economy, which was already struggling, completely seized up. The supply of essential goods to the cities and the army dried up. Riots broke out. People were being executed for selling a tunic for 3 copper coins over the legal limit, while the cities starved. Lactantius, a Christian writer of the time, gleefully recorded the failure of the edict, writing, "Having tried to enforce this law, he caused much bloodshed, and out of fear, nothing was offered for sale, and the scarcity grew much worse, until after the death of many, the law was repealed, out of mere necessity." Diocletian eventually abdicated, retiring to a palace in Split to grow cabbages, leaving behind an empire that was heavily militarized, deeply authoritarian, and economically paralyzed. He had saved the Roman state from military destruction, but he had killed the free market. The Roman citizen was no longer a participant in a global economy. He was a captive of the state, frozen in his profession, forced to surrender his produce to the tax collectors at gunpoint. Part 2. The two-tiered economy, the outsourcing of empire, and the end of complexity. If Diocletian broke the Roman economy, his successor, Constantine the Great, sealed its coffin. Constantine is famous for legalizing Christianity and moving the capital to Constantinople. But from an economic perspective, Constantine's most consequential act was his currency reform, which fundamentally destroyed the Roman middle class and created a level of wealth inequality that would doom the Western Empire. Constantine and the two-tiered economy. Constantine understood that the old silver and bronze coins were completely worthless. The hyperinflation of the 3rd century had destroyed trust in them. The state needed a way to pay its highest-ranking officials, its elite generals, and its core bureaucracy in a currency that actually held value. So, Constantine introduced a new coin, the solidus. The solidus was a gold coin of incredible purity. It was struck at a standard of 72 to a pound of gold. It was a beautiful, heavy, reliable coin, and it became the dollar of the late antique world. It was so stable and trusted that it would remain the standard currency of Mediterranean trade for the next 700 years, long after the Western Roman Empire had fallen. But here's the dark side of the solidus. Constantine only minted it in relatively small quantities, and he only used it to pay the elite. The senators, the high-ranking generals, the provincial governors, and the wealthy landowners were paid in gold solidi. But what about the common soldiers? What about the civil servants? What about the ordinary citizens? They were still paid in the old, debased copper and bronze coins, which Constantine continued to mint in massive inflationary quantities to fund his massive civil wars against his co-emperors. This created a devastating two-tiered economy. The rich, who were connected to the state apparatus and received gold, were completely insulated from inflation. In fact, as the copper coins lost value, the purchasing power of the gold solidus actually increased. The elite were getting richer in real terms, hoarding massive quantities of gold in their rural villas. Meanwhile, the poor, the soldiers, and the middle class were paid in copper. They were subjected to relentless, grinding inflation. Their wages bought less and less every year. The wealth gap in the late Roman Empire became an abyss. The traditional middle class, the merchants, the artisans, the local town councilors was completely wiped out. You were either a multi-millionaire senator hoarding gold, or you were a peasant or a soldier struggling to buy a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow of copper coins. This extreme wealth inequality had a fatal political consequence. The ultra-rich senatorial class, particularly in the Western Empire, in Italy, Gaul, and Spain, became so immensely wealthy and so disconnected from the struggles of the state that they simply refused to pay taxes. They used their immense political leverage to secure tax exemptions for their massive latifundia estates. The tax burden therefore fell entirely on the people who had the least ability to pay, the remaining smallholder farmers and the struggling urban poor. The Roman state was essentially bankrupting its own population to protect the offshore bank accounts of the 1%. When the state finally needed money to fight off the Goths and the Vandals in the 5th century, the treasury was empty because the people who actually had the gold were hiding it, and the people who didn't have the gold had already been squeezed dry. The outsourcing of empire, barbarians as contractors. This brings us to the most misunderstood aspect of the fall of Rome, the barbarians. When we hear the word barbarian, we picture mindless savages foaming at the mouth, eager to burn libraries and smash aqueducts. But the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Alemanni, were not mindless. They were highly organized, deeply ambitious, and acutely aware of the wealth of the Roman Empire. They didn't just want to destroy Rome, they wanted a piece of it. They wanted the Roman gold, the Roman land, and the Roman prestige. And the Roman emperors, facing a massive demographic collapse due to plagues and economic ruin and a bankrupt treasury, realized they could no longer afford to recruit, train, and pay Roman citizens to man the legions. The Roman citizen, crushed by taxes and inflation, was fleeing the draft. So, the Roman state did what modern corporations do when labor gets too expensive. They outsourced. They began hiring entire Germanic tribes to fight for Rome. These tribes were known as foederati. Rome signed treaties with them, granting them land inside the borders of the empire, usually in depopulated frontier zones, in exchange for military service. This wasn't an invasion. This was a massive, state-sponsored immigration and military contracting program. The Roman army of the 4th and 5th centuries was overwhelmingly Germanic. The generals, commanding the Roman armies in defense of Rome, were often men of barbarian descent. Men like Stilicho, who was half Vandal, or Ricimer, who was Suebian and Visigothic. The barbarization of the army wasn't a failure of Roman culture. It was an economic necessity. Rome was buying cheap foreign labor to do the dying because it could no longer afford to pay its own citizens. But outsourcing your national defense to foreign mercenaries comes with a massive, inherent risk. You have to pay them. And as we've established, the Western Roman Empire was completely broke. 410 AD, the ultimate labor dispute. This financial reality is the exact key to understanding the most famous event in the fall of Rome, the sack of Rome by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410 AD. Alaric was not a foreign invader who hated Rome. Alaric was a Roman general. He was a high-ranking officer in the Roman army, a magister militum, who had fought for the Emperor Theodosius at the Battle of the Frigidus. He was a Christian. His people, the Visigoths, were settled within the empire as foederati. Alaric's problem was simple. The Roman government in Ravenna, led by the incompetent and paranoid Emperor Honorius and his anti-barbarian ministers, kept failing to pay the Visigoths their contracted salaries, and failing to provide them with the land grants they had been promised. Alaric didn't want to destroy the Roman Empire. He wanted a promotion, a Roman title, and the back pay his men were owed. For years, Alaric marched his army up and down Italy, negotiating with the Senate, trying to secure a contract. He blockaded Rome, not to burn it, but to squeeze the Senate for gold. When the sack of Rome finally happened in 410 AD, it wasn't a clash of civilization. It was a violent labor dispute. It was a mercenary captain whose contract had been breached, finally losing patience, and allowing his unpaid, angry troops to loot the city for 3 days to take their back pay by force. The psychological shockwave it sent through the Mediterranean world was immense. Street Jerome wept in Bethlehem when he heard the news, but economically, it was just a symptom of a state that had defaulted on its debts. The true collapse of the West happened a few decades later, when the Vandals, a completely different group, conquered North Africa in 439 AD. North Africa was the breadbasket of the Western Empire. It was the province that generated the massive tax surpluses and the grain shipments that fed the city of Rome and paid the armies in Gaul. When the Vandals seized Carthage, they cut the jugular vein of the Western Roman state. The tax revenue plummeted to zero. Without the gold from Africa, the Western emperors couldn't pay the remaining Roman armies in Italy and Gaul. The armies disbanded or defected to local warlords. The state simply evaporated, because it could no longer meet payroll. In 476 AD, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, it wasn't a dramatic, bloody coup. It was an accounting decision. Odoacer looked at the ledger, realized there was no point in maintaining the expensive, hollow fiction of a Western emperor, so he fired him, packed up the imperial regalia, and mailed it to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, essentially saying, "We don't need this middle management anymore. We'll run Italy ourselves." The end of complexity, the true tragedy of the fall. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most profound thing historians get wrong about the fall of Rome. They focus on the loss of political unity, or the loss of grand architecture. But the true horror of the fall of Rome was the loss of economic complexity. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, in his masterful book The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, points out that the Roman Empire provided a standard of living for ordinary people that would not be seen again in Europe until the 19th century. Because of the massive integrated supply chain, ordinary Romans had access to mass-produced, high-quality goods. Archaeologists digging in the humblest peasant huts in Roman Britain find high-quality, wheel-thrown pottery, roof tiles, and iron tools. They find coins. They find evidence of a diet that included olive oil and wine imported from across the sea. When the Roman state collapsed, the supply chains collapsed with it. The currency vanished. The roads became unsafe. The specialized factories that mass-produced pottery shut down because there was no safe way to transport the goods to market and no stable currency to facilitate trade. The transition to the Dark Ages wasn't just about losing emperors. It was about losing the ability to make roof tile. It was about losing the ability to smelt iron on an industrial scale. It was about the complete evaporation of literacy because you no longer had a massive state bureaucracy that required clerks to read and write tax receipts. The economy localized. People went back to subsistence farming. If you needed a pot, you had to make it yourself, by hand out of local clay. And it was thick, ugly, and brittle. If you needed a nail, you had to forge it yourself. The sheer mind-boggling complexity of the Roman economy, the invisible web of trust, currency, and logistics that allowed a farmer in Gaul to benefit from the labor of a miner in Spain, was severed. The fall of Rome was a catastrophic simplification of human existence, and it was caused by the internal rot of a financial system that destroyed its own currency, hollowed out its middle class, and allowed a tiny elite to hoard the wealth while the state starved. The modern parallels, a warning from the ledger. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the deeper you look at the economic collapse of Rome, the more uncomfortable the parallels become with our own time. We look at the Roman Empire, and we see a distant, ancient civilization that failed because they wore togas and fought with swords. But the mechanics of their collapse are terrifyingly modern. Look at the currency debasement. The Roman emperors faced structural deficits due to massive military spending and social welfare programs, the grain dole. Instead of making the hard political choices to balance the budget, they chose the path of least resistance. They printed the money. They debased the currency. They transferred the wealth from the savers and the poor to the state through the invisible tax of inflation. Does the modern reliance on fiat currency, central bank quantitative easing, and the continuous expansion of the money supply to fund government deficits feel uncomfortably familiar? Look at the wealth inequality. The late Roman Empire was defined by a tiny elite of ultra-wealthy senators who used their political power to avoid taxation, while the crushing tax burden fell on the shrinking middle class and the working poor. The middle class was liquidated, pushing the population into a rigid, two-tiered system of the ultra-rich and the dependent poor. When the crisis came, the elite hoarded their gold in their rural estates, leaving the state bankrupt and unable to defend the borders. Look at the regulatory capture and the freezing of the economy. Diocletian's attempt to fix inflation through price controls, and by legally forcing people to stay in their current professions, was a desperate attempt by a failing state to exert control over a market it had broken. It resulted in black markets, a collapse of production, and the death of economic mobility. And look at the reliance on outsourcing. The Roman state, unable or unwilling to fund a military drawn from its own citizenry, outsourced its defense to foreign contractors who had no deep ideological loyalty to the concept of Rome, only to the gold they were promised. When the gold stopped flowing, the contractors simply took the land for themselves. The Great Fall of Rome wasn't an accident. It wasn't a sudden military defeat. It was a systemic failure a cascade of economic errors and miscalculations that fed on each other until the entire globalized system collapsed under their weight. The Romans didn't realize they were falling. To a citizen in the late 4th century, the empire still looked massive. The aqueducts still flowed, mostly. The marble statues still stood. The emperors still issued grand decrees. But the underlying financial architecture, the trust in the money, the complex supply chains, the shared economic destiny of the provinces, was already dead. The barbarians didn't kill the Roman Empire. They just moved into the house after the Romans had already foreclosed on themselves. The conventional story of the fall of Rome is a comforting one in a way. It tells us that empires fall because of external enemies or because of a sudden loss of moral virtue. It implies that as long as we have strong borders and good values, we are safe. But the real story is far less reassuring. The real story is that complex civilizations are incredibly fragile, and they are entirely dependent on the invisible, delicate webs of finance, trust, and supply chains. When a state destroys its own currency to fund its ambitions, when it allows extreme inequality to hollow out its middle class, and when it prioritizes short-term political survival over long-term economic stability, it plants the seeds of its own destruction. And the most sobering lesson of all is this: the people who destroyed the Roman economy didn't think they were destroying it. The emperors who debased the denarius thought they were saving the army and protecting the frontiers. Diocletian thought his price controls were protecting the poor from greedy merchants. The wealthy senators who dodged taxes thought they were just protecting their family legacies. They weren't evil. They were just reacting to the incentives of a broken system. And the difference between a golden age and a dark age came down to whether the people in charge understood the limits of their own financial reality. That's the real lesson of the fall of Rome. Not that barbarians are at the gates. The lesson is that the gates don't matter if the treasury is empty, the money is worthless, and the citizens no longer believe the system works for them. So the next time someone tells you that Rome fell because the barbarians were too strong, or because the Romans forgot how to fight, you'll know better. You'll know that the crash was just the final symptom. The real causes were deeper, older, and far more human than any battlefield could reveal. They were rooted in debt, in inflation, in greed, in extreme inequality, and in the fatal assumption that a government can perpetually print its way out of reality. And those causes, in one form or another, are still with us. If this deep dive into the hidden economic history of the ancient world reshaped the way you think about our modern financial system, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forces that actually move markets, nations, and the global order. The kind of stories that don't make the evening news, but quietly shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Which factor do you think was the most critical cause of Rome's economic collapse? Was it the military spending, the currency debasement, or the extreme wealth inequality? I'd love to hear your take. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about understanding how money, power, and history actually intersect. I'll see you in the next video.